Welcome to Back on the Stack, a cEDH channel. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe to show your support. Another way to support us is to check out our Bonfire site, where we have a great selection of wearables with our rad logo. Now, let's get right into it and see what decks are being piloted tonight.
Hey everybody, it's Eli, and tonight I'm piloting Vial. This is a traditional Turbo Grixis list that happens to also have some combos with Malcolm in the command zone. I'm in seat 1 and ahead of mold of 4, so I'll keep this hand for hopefully a turn 2 Malcolm with Reckless Fireweaver as backup.
Tonight I'm piloting Erinis Gloomstalker with Street Urchin as my background. This list looks to ultimately win through a conspicuous Snoop line, but does offer a few other combos. Milling the entire deck through Hermit Druid with either Breach in hand or activating Shift in Woodland to become a copy of Breach easily helps you assemble the line. With my background, I'm able to ping creatures on the table with Erinis, and because he has Death Touch, they die immediately. For game 1, I kept second 7, mainly because fetch lands in this deck are very important with Erinis, and Sylvan Library will help with the poor card draw in Gruul.
Hello everyone, my name is Alec, and I'm going to be piloting Lumra, Bellow of the Woods, also known as the Cocaine Bear. This opening hand is everything I dream of for this list, as I have a turn 1 stacks piece with Root Maze to slow down my opponents, and a way to break parity with Nissa, Resurgent Animist. As well, I have a follow-up combo piece from Springheart Nantuko. With Springheart Nantuko bestowed on Lumra and a Nissa Resurgent Animist in play, and just enough luck, I can churn through my deck and use various land ETBs to kill the whole table. So let's get that job done.
Hey everyone, it's Jordan back with my Tymna Thrasios pile. This is a mid-range list that hopes to assemble one of its many infinite mana combos, either through things like Devoted Druid and Hazels, or Machine Gods, or Kinnan and Basalt Monolith, Valley Floodcaller, Retraction Helix. It has the whole works in there. I decided to keep this 6 in hopes of a little bit slower of a game with some tutors and some early game mana, hoping to draw into, maybe a little bit more early game mana. That way I could try to get these tutors online a little bit sooner.
With introductions out of the way, Eli will kick us off. He draws and plays Flooded Strand for turn. He passes. J-Rock draws and plays Arid Mesa for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches Taiga to the battlefield. He casts Birds of Paradise. He passes. Alec draws and plays Conduit Pylons for turn. It ETBs and he surveils 1, leaving it on top. He casts Soul Ring. He casts Mox Diamond. It ETBs and he discards Wasteland. He casts Root Maze. He passes the turn. Jordan draws and plays Marsh Flats, which enters tapped due to Root Maze. He attempts to pass, but in his end step, Eli pays a life, sacks his Flooded Strand, and fetches Undercity Sewers to the battlefield. It ETBs and he surveils 1, putting Valley Floodcaller into his graveyard. The turn then moves to Eli. Eli draws and plays a tapped Badlands. He passes. J-Rock draws and plays a tapped Stomping Grounds. He casts Sylvan Library. He passes. Alec draws and casts Nissa, Resurgent Animist. He plays Urza's Cave. He passes. Jordan draws and plays Besaja Who Endures. He pays a life, sacks his Marsh Flats, and fetches Watery Grave to the battlefield. He passes. Eli draws and plays Marsh Flats for turn. He casts Rite of Flame. It resolves and he adds 2 red to his pool. He uses it to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He passes. At the beginning of his draw step, Sylvan Library triggers and J-Rock draws 3 cards, keeping them all and paying 8 life. He plays a tapped Arena of Glory for turn. He casts his commander, Erinis Gloomstalker. He passes. Alec draws and plays High Market for turn. Nissa triggers and he adds a green to his pool. He uses it to help cast his commander, Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. It ETBs and he mills 4 cards, then returns all land cards from his graveyard to the battlefield tapped. He returns Wastelands and Hickory Woodlot. Nissa triggers and he adds 2 green and then reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals an elf or an elemental. He reveals and puts to hand Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. He uses his 2 green to cast Lotus Cobra. He passes. Jordan draws and plays a tapped Underground Sea. He casts Delighted Halfling. He casts Imperial Seal. It resolves and he tutors a card to the top of his library, loses 2 life, and passes the turn. Eli draws and plays a tapped Verdant Catacombs for turn. He moves to combat and swings Malcolm at J-Rock. He takes the damage. Malcolm triggers on damage and Eli creates a treasure token, which also enters tapped due to Root Maze. He passes. At the beginning of his draw step, Sylvan Library triggers and J-Rock draws 3 cards, keeping 1 and putting 2 back on top. He immediately moves to combat and swings Erinis at Eli. Erinis triggers on attack and he returns Arid Mesa from his graveyard to the battlefield. Eli takes the damage. In his second main phase, he casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Erinis as an additional cost. It resolves and he tutors Kiki Jiki to the battlefield. He passes. Alec draws and immediately casts Ashaya. Both Lotus Cobra and Nissa trigger from the ETB since all non-token creatures Alec controls are also forest lands. He uses the 2 green he just created to bestow Spring Heart Nantuko, enchanting Lumra. He plays Misty Rainforest. It ETBs and he makes 2 green through both Nissa and Lotus Cobra. Spring Heart Nantuko also triggers and he uses the 2 green to make a token copy of Lumra. It gets sacrificed to the Legend rule, but the ETB still happens. He mills 4 cards and returns all lands to the battlefield tapped. He returns Gaia's Cradle and Nyxoth, Shrine to Nyx. They both ETB and he adds 4 green mana through Lotus Cobra and Nissa. Springheart triggers twice and he pays for both with the floating green, creating 2 more copies of Lumra. With the table out of interaction, Alec is free to present his win con. He pays 3 into Urza's Cave, sacrificing it and tutoring Vesuva to the battlefield. It enters tapped as a copy of any lamb. Because Ashaya turns all non-token creatures into forests, Vesuva enters as a copy of Lumra, which is sacrificed to the Legend rule. Alec then presents a loop of playing Vesuva as a copy of Lumra, having it get sacrificed to the Legend rule, but then milling 4 cards and returning it to the battlefield. He is then able to mill his entire deck and continue the loop until he has Lotus Field and Sunscorched Desert. When Sunscorched Desert ETBs, it does 1 damage to a target opponent. When Lotus Field ETBs, he has to sacrifice 2 lands. He sacrifices both Sunscorched Desert and Lotus Field itself. He continues this loop repeatedly, returning Sunscorched Desert and Lotus Field to the battlefield until he has pinged all of his opponents to death, and Alec wins the game. Well, to be honest, the entire table was so impressed with Lumra, we decided to shuffle up, re-randomize seed order, and play again.
Hello again. This mulligan was a little rough for me, but I decided to keep this hand being in first seat. I can play out the Havenwood Battleground and have 3 mana for turn 2 if needed. Figured in this pod we'll have lots of interaction around the table, so a slow safe hand looked good to me. Realms Uncharted is one of those cards I can use for this list to pivot my game plan on a dime. With all the various utility land effects I run in this list, I should be able to assemble some strong value from a hand like this, as slow as it may appear.
So in game 2, I decided to keep this 6 because it has everything that we want out of a hand. You know, some early game mana, turn 2 Ristic, some interaction on Swan Song, Boseiju, and then either a win attempt or just a tutor with the Tainted Pact.
For game 2, I kept first 7, because Hermit Druid, with Underworld Breach in hand, is a win con. Plus, the Arena of Glory can give Hermit Druid haste. I'm hoping to avoid stack pieces and push out an early win.
For game 2, I'm in 4th seat with a mold of 5. It's a turn 1 Mystic Remora and a turn 1 Mana Vault, hopefully into a turn 2 Malcolm. We'll see if this is enough to get us there.
With opening hands decided, Alec will start us off. He draws and plays Havenwood Battleground for turn. He passes. Jordan draws and plays Wooded Foothills for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches Savannah to the battlefield. He casts Birds of Paradise. He passes. J-Rock draws and plays Bloodstained Mire for turn. He passes. Eli draws and plays Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Mystic Remora. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding 1 red. He uses it to cast Soul Ring. He casts Mana Vault. He passes. Alec draws and plays Urza's Saga for turn. It ETBs and he adds a lore counter. He passes. Jordan draws and plays Boseiju Who Endures for turn. He casts Ristic Study. Fish triggers and Eli draws. Jordan attempts to pass, but in his end step, J-Rock pays a life, sacks his Bloodstained Mire, and fetches Commercial District to the battlefield. It ETBs and he surveils 1, putting Lion's Eye Diamond into the graveyard. The turn then moves to J-Rock. J-Rock draws and plays Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth for turn. He casts Arcane Signet. Ristic and Fish both trigger, Jordan and Eli both draw. He moves through phases and passes the turn. In his upkeep, Eli pays for Fish. He draws and plays Verdant Catacombs for turn. He casts his commander, Malcolm. Ristic triggers and he pays. He pays a life, sacks his Verdant Catacombs, and fetches Badlands to the battlefield. He casts Ragavan. Ristic triggers and Jordan draws. Eli then passes. Alec draws and adds a lore counter to Urza's Saga. He plays Urza's Cave for turn. He passes. Jordan draws and plays Tundra for turn. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It ETBs and he tutors Esper Sentinel to hand. He casts the Esper. He passes. J-Rock draws and plays Arena of Glory. He exerts Arena to help cast his commander, Erinis, Street Gloom, which has haste but won't untap during the next untap step. Ristic triggers and Jordan draws. J-Rock moves to combat and swings Erinis at Alec. Erinis triggers on attack and he returns Bloodstained Mire from his graveyard to the battlefield. Alec then takes the damage. In his second main phase, J-Rock pays a life, sacks Bloodstained Mire, and fetches Stomping Ground to the battlefield, shocking it in. He casts his background, Street Urchin. Fish, Ristic, and Esper all trigger, Jordan draws 2, and Eli draws 1. He then passes the turn. In his upkeep, Eli pays for Fish. He draws and immediately casts Curiosity, targeting Malcolm. Ristic and Esper both trigger, and Jordan draws 2. Eli moves to combat and declares Ragavan at J-Rock and Malcolm at Jordan. In response, Alec casts Realms Uncharted, targeting J-Rock. Fish, Esper, and Ristic all trigger, Eli draws 1, and Jordan draws 2. Then Alec searches up Lotus Field, Crystal Vein, Crumbling Vestige, and City of Traders. J-Rock gives him Crystal Vein and Lotus Field. The other two go to the graveyard. J-Rock and Jordan both take a damage, and on damage, Ragavan, Malcolm, and Curiosity all trigger. Eli makes 3 treasure tokens, draws a card through Curiosity, and J-Rock exiles the top card of his library, which is Goro Goro. In his second main phase, Eli plays Flooded Strand for turn. He passes. Alec draws and adds a third lore counter to Urza's Saga. He taps it to float a colorless, sacks it, and fetches Amulet of Vigor to the battlefield. He sacrifices Havenwood Battleground for 2 green. He plays Lotus Field for turn. It ETBs untapped through Amulet of Vigor. With the sacrifice 2 lands trigger on the stack, he taps it to float 3 green and then sacrifices Lotus Field and Urza's Cave. He casts his commander, Lumra. Rhystic triggers and he pays. Lumra ETBs and dies to state-based actions since Alec now controls 0 lands. The ETB then happens and he mills 4 cards, which are Mouth of Ranum, Tireless Provisioner, Arid Archway, and Tempt with Discovery. Then he returns all land cards to the battlefield tapped. However, Amulet of Vigor has them all untapped. Crumbling Vestige ETBs and he adds 1 green. Arid Archway ETBs and he returns Crumbling Vestige to hand, tapping it first to float a colorless. Lotus Field ETBs and he sacks City of Traders and Arid Archway, tapping them both to float 4 more colorless. He recasts Lumra. Rhystic triggers and he pays. With Lumra's ETB on the stack, he sacrifices Havenwood Battleground for 2 green and uses it to help pay 3 into Urza's Cave, sacrificing it and tutoring Mirror Pool to the battlefield. Then, Lumra's ETB trigger happens. He mills 4 cards, which are Karn the Great Creator, Gemstone Caverns, Green Sun Zenith, and Timeless Witness. Then he returns all lands to the battlefield. Arid Archway ETBs and he returns Gemstone Caverns to hand, tapping it for a colorless mana first. He casts Trinisphere. Fish, Rhystic, and Esper all trigger, Eli draws 1, and Jordan draws 2. With Trinisphere on the stack, Jordan casts Worldly Tutor. Fish triggers and Eli draws. In response, Eli casts Pyroblast, targeting Rhystic Study. Rhystic and Esper both trigger, but in response to the draws, Alec pays 3 to sacrifice Urza's Cave, tutoring Vesuva to the battlefield. It ETBs and he has it become a copy of Lotus Field. It ETBs and he sacrifices Vesuva and City of Traders, tapping the Vesuva for 3 green first. He then pays 5 into Mirror Pool, sacrificing it and creating a token copy of Lumra. It dies to the Legend Rule. The ETB then happens. Alec mills 4 cards, which are a basic forest, Force of Vigor, Song of Dryads, and a Lion's Eye Diamond. He then returns all lands to the battlefield. Vesuva ETBs and he has it become a copy of Lotus Field. It ETBs and he sacrifices the original Lotus Field and Mouth of Ranum. Then Jordan finally draws 2 from his delayed triggers. With Pyroblast back on the stack, Jordan pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Fish triggers and Eli draws. Then Mental Misstep counters Pyroblast, and Worldly Tutor resolves. Jordan tutors Seedborn Muse to the top of his library. With Trinisphere back on the stack, Eli casts Deadly Rolic, targeting Ranger Captain. Rhystic triggers and he pays. In response, Jordan cracks the Ranger Captain, locking his opponents out from casting non-creature spells. Then Trinisphere finally resolves. The turn then moves to Jordan. Jordan draws and plays Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Seedborn Muse. He moves to his end step, discarding the hand size, and passes. J-Rock draws and plays Gaia's Cradle for turn. He moves through phases and attempts to pass, but in his end step, Eli pays a life, sacks his Flooded Strand, and fetches Undercity Sewers to the battlefield. It ETBs and he surveils Poliwag into the graveyard. The turn then moves to Eli. In his upkeep, Eli sacrifices Fish. He draws and plays Steam Vents for turn, shocking it in. He moves to combat and swings both creatures at J-Rock. He declares no blocks. On damage, Ragavan, Malcolm, and Curiosity all trigger. Eli makes 3 treasure tokens and draws a card through Curiosity. Then J-Rock exiles the top card of his library, which is Conspicuous Snoop. In his second main phase, Eli casts Rhystic Study. Esper and Rhystic both trigger, he pays for 1 and Jordan draws for 1. In response, Jordan pays 3 to cast Tainted Pact. In response to that, Alec pays 3 to sack Urza's Cave and tutors Talon Gates of Madara. It ETBs and he targets Erinis to be phased out. In response, J-Rock pays 3 to cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Arena of Glory as an additional cost. It resolves and he tutors Dryad Arbor to the battlefield. He then activates his commander through the background, paying 1 and sacrificing Dryad Arbor to deal 1 Death Touch damage to Lumra. Then Erinis is phased out. Tainted Pact then resolves and Jordan exiles cards from the top of his library, stopping at Force of Will. Then Eli's Rhystic Study resolves and he passes the turn. Alec draws and adds a second lore counter to Urza's Saga. He casts Dryad's Revival, targeting Urza's Cave in his graveyard. both Ristics and Esper all trigger. Eli draws 1 and Jordan draws 2. It resolves and he returns it to hand, and then immediately plays it as his land for turn, sacrificing City of Traders. He passes. Jordan draws and plays City of Brass for turn. He casts Smothering Tithe. Ristic triggers and Eli draws. Jordan casts his commander, Thrasios. Ristic triggers and Eli draws. Smothering Tithe triggers and Eli pays. Jordan then moves to his end step, discarding a hand size, and passes. In J-Rock's untapped step, Erinis phases back in. He draws, Tithe triggers, and Jordan creates a treasure token. J-Rock casts Hermit Druid. Both Ristics trigger, both Jordan and Eli draw, and Jordan makes a Tithe treasure from Eli. J-Rock moves to combat and declares Erinis at Eli. On attack, Erinis triggers, and J-Rock returns Dryad Arbor to the battlefield from his graveyard. Eli takes the damage. In his second main phase, he pays 3 to cast Skirk Prospector. Both Ristics trigger, both Jordan and Eli draw, and Jordan makes a Tithe treasure. He uses his 1 floating green to activate his commander through his background, sacrificing Dryad Arbor to do 1 Death Touch damage to Seedborn Muse. In response, Jordan activates Thrasios, putting Gaia's Cradle into play tapped. Then, Seedborn is destroyed. J-Rock then passes. Eli draws and Jordan creates a Tithe treasure. Eli plays City of Traders for turn. He moves to combat and swings Ragavan and Malcolm at Alec. In response, Alec pays 2, taps Urza Saga, and creates a 3/3 construct, which he uses to block Ragavan. On damage, Malcolm and Curiosity both trigger. Eli creates a treasure token and draws a card through Curiosity. Tithe triggers and Jordan creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Eli casts Defense Grid. Esper and Ristic both trigger and Jordan draws 2. In response, Jordan pays 3 to cast Force of Will for its alternative casting cost, exiling Kinnan. Ristic triggers and he pays. Then, Force of Will counters Defense Grid. Eli then casts Demonic Tutor. Ristic triggers and Jordan draws. Then Eli tutors a card to hand. He then casts Tainted Pact. Ristic triggers and Jordan draws. Then Eli exiles all the cards in his library except the bottom 2, putting Force of Will to hand. He then casts Thassa's Oracle. It ETBs, and with his devotion to blue being greater than the cards left in his library, Eli wins the game. We have never seen a mono-green deck with so much capability to interact with the board. Thanks to Alec for coming on the show and piloting his land deck. Check out all the deck links listed below, and we will see you back on the stack.
I would rather save my interaction for known I can't even say the word snoop line stuff. I feel like you're about to pop at any time. I'm so scared. You have first 7 and you're just like just doing my thing. I don't know what's going on.